heretics. They believed that they were Nestorian. Remember, we dealt with Nestorius at the Council of Ephesus in 431. And Nestorius denied that Mary was the mother of God, and he believed that Christ was really kind of two persons. There was a divine person and a human person. Remember, in that the divine person just took on this kind of human fleshy garment. But there wasn't one person of Christ who had a divine and a human nature joined together in theologically what's called the hypostatic union. Right? So the monophysites believe that because the church teaches that Christ is one divine person with a human and a divine nature, that they were somehow Nestorian. They were Nestorian in their belief, and therefore they believed in two persons of Jesus. And so we, the Church Orthodox Church, was heretical. So there was a lot of theological confusion during this period of time. So Justinian wants to end this discussion. He wants to end the controversy that's going on. And so he proposes a compromise position to try to end these discussions between the monophysites and the church. And what he says is, what he does is he issues an edict which affirms the teaching of Chalcedon, again anathematizing and condemning the teachings of Eutyches, the monophysite heresy of Christ only having one nature. But he also issues, as a part of this edict, anathemas against the writings of three bishop theologians. And they become known as the three chapters. And the reason why he condemned the three chapters, because the monophysites believed that they were heretics because their writings had influenced Nestorius. So we have the monophysites agitating and saying that these three theologians influenced Nestorius, and so the Orthodox Church believes in Nestorian heresy. And then you had the church, obviously, who had taught against the monophysites at the Council of Chalcedon. So there's this theological controversy. It's very complex and very convoluted that's raging now in the church. The problem, though, was that with this edict and with these anathemas of the three chapters, these three theologians, is that some of their writings had been declared orthodox at the Council of Chalcedon. So Justinian's edict, from the point of view of the Pope, seemed to be repudiating parts of the Council of Chalcedon. And that was a threat, obviously, to the orthodox teaching of the church. So again, the issue is, who decides orthodoxy in the church? Is it the emperor or is it the Pope? So Pope Vigilaeus is Pope at this period of time, and Justinian's edict was sent to Rome for his approval. So he reads the document, the edict, and he refuses to approve it. Now, Vigilaeus was actually a very interesting character, because he had been previously, before he was elected Pope, he had been the papal legate in Constantinople, so the Pope's representative in Constantinople. He became Pope through kind of shady political maneuverings, and there's some question as to perhaps he was very involved in the imperial court in Constantinople, and he might have made some kind of deal with the emperor in order to become Pope. So that he came to the papacy in kind of these shady political maneuverings. So Justinian, because Vigilaeus, so Justinian actually thought that he had the Pope in his back pocket. So he thought that if he issued this edict, the Pope would just merely wave his hand and approve it, and all would be good. Well, when Vigilaeus decided not to do that, Justinian was very upset. So he ordered Vigilaeus to come to Constantinople to convene a synod to discuss this whole issue, this whole controversy. Now, Vigilaeus demurred and didn't go, so Justinian sent troops to Rome and had the Pope arrested while he was saying Mass in the Church of St. Cecilia in 545. He brings Vigilaeus back to the east and holds him prisoner for the next several years. 5 years after his arrest, Vigilaeus proposes to Justinian that he call an ecumenical council in order to settle this matter once and for all. So eventually, the ecumenical council of Second Constantinople is called in 553. The three chapters, the three theologians, their writings were condemned, but the teachings of the church at Ephesus and Chalcedon were reiterated. In essence, that Christ is one divine person with a human and a divine nature that are united in the hypostatic union. So ultimately, as a result of all these political maneuverings and all this controversy, the Orthodox faith of the Church is maintained, and the answer to the question, who determines orthodoxy, the Emperor or the Pope, squarely falls on the hands and on the side of the Pope. But we see again, this is just another important data point in a whole line of data points of the Eastern emperors in particular engaging themselves in church affairs where they really have no business. And that's going to, again, continue to cause this tension that exists between the East and the West and will culminate in the 11th century. Now, Vigilius, a few years after the council, is on his way back to Rome and dies in Sicily on his way back to his city. So this theological controversy is erupting in the middle part of the 6th century, and now we take a step back and shift gears and look at the whole main theme of this time period, the time period of missionaries and emperor, and look at the missionaries that the church sends out to convert the Western European German barbarians and those who had fallen away from the faith. Now remember I said how large segments of the European population at this time were pagan, and many of the German barbarian tribes, if they had converted to the Christian faith, had converted to a heretical notion of the faith of Arianism. So now this is the time of missionaries who will go forth and spread the Orthodox faith to them. And in particular, the first man who really, in a certain sense, it becomes a missionary of huge importance is Saint Benedict. Now a lot of times we don't think of Saint Benedict, who is the founder of Benedictine monasticism, as being a missionary. And perhaps in the traditional sense of being a missionary, he's not. I mean, he didn't travel off to a foreign land and engage in missionary efforts, but what he did do was he formed a community of men, formed a particular way of living together in communion, and wrote a rule. And that rule would be spread throughout all of Western Europe, and monasteries under the rule of Saint Benedict would pop up all throughout Western Europe. And so in that sense, St. Benedict, I think, can be considered a missionary. He's known as the father of Western monasticism. He actually came from a noble Roman family. He renounced his worldly life and all of the trappings that came with his nobility to go and live as a hermit. He gained a reputation for holiness, and as I've said multiple times in previous sessions, holiness attracts. And so St. Benedict's holiness became well known, and people were attracted to him to join him in living this holy life that he chose for himself. So in the year 530, he founds the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy. His sister is a woman by the name of Saint Scholastica, and she also entered into a religious life, and a life of deep solitude with God, and she founded communities for women. And so we have these two great brothers, this brother and sister team, really forming the foundation of monasticism and the religious life throughout the western part of the church. Now, what was Benedict's vision for monasticism? What made his way of life different, and why did it spread so extensively throughout Europe? Well, he really saw monasticism as a school of divine service. When you became a monk, you entered into the service of God, and in the monastic community, you were in school, really. You were learning how to be of divine service to God. You were learning how to become more close to God, closer to God, and how to reflect the image of Christ in the world. He formed his community around an obedience to a certain way of life, to a routine of work and prayer, study, fasting, and self-denial. Those were the hallmarks of a Benedictine monk. Of fasting, praying, self-denial, and of work in particular. And the whole point of the monk in his life was centered on an imitation of Christ. The whole reason why he became a monk was to imitate Christ, live a life of chastity, of prayer, work, temperance, and obedience in particular. So St. Benedict wrote a rule that governed his community, and he focused in particular on the establishment of the office of the abbot and the role that the abbot, or the leader of men in this monastery, would undertake. And so he made the abbot of the community was elected by the members, but he was elected for life. So you served as abbot until your death, and he talked about how the abbot needed to be a father figure to these fellow monks, and he needed to exercise his leadership over these monks in the example of Christ, and being a servant leader. Not an autocratic or dictatorial leader, but a servant leader, meaning one who came to serve, not be served. That was the way that the abbot was called to live out his office. He also, in this rule, not only did he focus on the role of the abbot, but he focused on the organized life that the monks were to live. And so he organized their life into a series of a routine, where it would be prayer and work, or as it's known in Latin, ora et labora, prayer and work. Those were the two foundational elements of Benedictine monastery. The monk would be contemplative in terms of praying, and through prayer growing closer to God, but the monk would also be active and go and would stay in the community of the monastery, but would work. There would be some kind of manual work that the monks would undertake in order to occupy their time and their day. And one of the works that they performed was the copying of scriptures and the copying of manuscripts in scriptoriums. And it's really through the efforts of the Benedictine monks, and as we'll see later through Charlemagne and his establishment of Benedictine monastic communities, that we have a lot of the patrimony of Western classical literature and of examples of the scriptures preserved down the ages to us. There were these monks who spent hours, countless hours, laboriously copying the scriptures and these ancient works of literature so that we could have them preserved for us, so we would know of them today. Now, we know an awful lot about St. Benedict because his biography was written by the second great pope in the history of the church, Pope St. Gregory the Great. Now, Gregory the Great reigned from 590 to 604. He was a very strong leader, and is known as the Great because he defended the church and the papacy against the incursions of secular rulers who were trying to control the papacy, and also because he was just a very strong leader during a time when the city of Rome itself needed a strong organizer and a strong leader to come in and to preserve culture and preserve a way of life. Now, the Italy of St. Gregory's time was an Italy in conflict. It was an Italy of conflict between this group of Germans called the Lombards and the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire under Justinian had launched military expeditions to try to take over or reclaim the western part of the empire that had fallen in 476. And so there were Byzantine outposts in Ravenna and other places in Italy. Now, the Lombards had come down from Germany, was modern-day Germany, and had attacked the Byzantines. And so there was warfare going on between the Lombards and the Byzantines during the reign of St. Gregory the Great. Now, also during his reign, there was a great plague and great famine that had erupted throughout the Italian countryside and was hard. The Romans themselves were hard pressed. So as a result of this horrible plague and famine, St. Gregory actually initiated a system of relief, of welfare for the poor around Rome. He had the church distribute food and bread to the poor. He opened and organized hospitals to provide health care for the poor and those who needed it. He took as his title of pope, the title that the pope still holds today, of Servus Servorum Dei, or servant of the servants of God. And so he took really to heart this notion that the Pope is called to not only be a ruler, temporally speaking, or in terms of the church government, and also a universal shepherd, but the Pope is called to really be a servant leader, to imitate Christ and to engage in social, in essence, in social work of passing out food and of helping those in need. He also preserved the tombs of saints throughout Rome. He wrote lives of saints. He also undertook a reform of the liturgy, which led to the issuance, or the creation rather, of Gregorian chant. The whole understanding of the way of worshiping in the liturgy and of raising our voices to God. He also wrote many, many theological and pastoral treatises. So in all these different ways, he is legitimately called Pope St. Gregory the Great. But perhaps his greatest achievement and his greatest accomplishment was his missionary efforts that he undertook and had the church undertake. There's a famous story of St. Gregory the Great. It was before he became pope. He was walking in the slave markets in Rome with a companion. And as he was walking in the slave markets, he saw a group of light-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. He had never seen these kind of people before. And so he turns to his companion and he says, who are these people? And his companion said, oh, those are Angles. And if you know the history of the Germanic tribes who had left the continent and settled in England, there were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Utes. And so these particular groups of people, this particular group of people that he saw were Angles, people who had left the continent, German tribes left the continent and settled in what is today modern England. So he saw these people, and his companion says they're Angles, and he turns to his companion and he says, no, not Angles, but angels. And he says, he stated that it's how sad it was that beings with such bright faces should be slaves of the Prince of Darkness, when they should be co-heirs with the angels in heaven. And so this was kind of an epiphany for him, that he recognized that these people, these beautiful people, did not have the light of Christ. These people who were, in his mind, not angels but angels, light-skinned, fair-haired beings, beautiful to behold like the angels, need the light of Christ. And so it was imperative in his mind that missionaries be sent to these angles in order to bring the light of Christ to them. So eventually in 597, after becoming Pope, he sends St. Augustine of Canterbury and 40 monks to the English to mission to them and to bring the light of Christ. And so in Christmas Day of 597, St. Augustine and his companions baptized 10,000 Englishmen that day. And that is really the beginning of the church's history in the great island nation of England, which we'll talk more about English history as we move into the 16th century a little bit later. So St. Gregory is also important in this terms of his missionary work because he established and helped provide missionary policy. St. Augustine asked him questions of how should I deal with the pagans in this circumstance? How do I mission to them properly? He wrote letters to St. Gregory, and St. Gregory responded and basically provided the framework for missionary procedures that the church should undertake. And it's missionary procedures that she followed throughout her history and even form the foundation of her missionary efforts today. And so when we come back from our break, we'll discuss his missionary procedures and how he answered those questions of St. Augustine, and we'll also continue on with our story and learn about the Irish and a very important saint, especially in the history of Germany, the Saint Boniface. So when we come back from our break, we'll learn those stories. To Epic, a journey through church history. So we go through the 2,000-year history of our great Catholic Church. And we're in the time period of missionaries and the emperor. And we just finished with the discussion before the break of St. Gregory the Great and how he began this missionary journey to England by sending St. Augustine of Canterbury and 40 of his companions in order to bring the gospel to the English. And so we saw too how St. Augustine asked St. Gregory many questions about missionary procedure and policy. How am I supposed to deal with pagan temples? Am I supposed to destroy them? Am I supposed to make new churches? How am I supposed to deal with this? He also wanted to know about pagan festivals. All these festivals that they would gather together and celebrate and party. Should I do away with those? Or should I allow them or institute Christian festivals? What should I do? So he wrote these letters to St. Gregory, and St. Gregory responded, and his response really formed the foundation for Catholic missionary procedure and policies for the next several thousand years in the church. And what he said was, he wrote back to St. Augustine and he said, destroy as few pagan temples as possible, only destroy their idols. Sprinkle them with holy water. Build altars and put relics in the buildings, so that if the temples have been well built, you are simply changing their purpose, which was the cult of demons, in order to make a place where from henceforth the true God will be worshipped. Thus the people, seeing that their places of worship have not been destroyed, will forget their errors, and having attained knowledge of the true God, will come to worship him in the very places where their ancestors assembled. And so, again, St. Gregory's advice here that forms the foundation of Catholic missionary procedure is very wise. He says, in essence, don't destroy their temples, but consecrate them to Christ. Make them Christian churches. So the people who have a habit of going to this particular place to assemble to worship will still continue to go there out of habit, but instead of worshiping a false god or false gods, they'll be worshiping the one true God. So don't destroy a culture, but separate from the culture what is evil and take what is left and make it Christian. And that forms the foundation that missionaries,